Hello and welcome to the Daily Fantasy Basketball Podcast. We're excited to have you here today. Tonight it is just me. This is Mark Roberts. Kyle is taking a rare break, so I'm going to try to keep this short and sweet, but I wanted to share with you guys tonight, and it's night for me. You can listen to this whenever you want, of course. The beauty of podcasting, I guess. Today, I'm going to be talking about the way I get ready for a fantasy draft or a fantasy auction, some of the things I try to keep in mind, and then along with that, just try to mention some of the players that I like this year based on where they're usually going in ESPN drafts. So this might be a good, if you're listening on audio and if you have a chance to look at the video, this might be a good one to try out for the video podcasts, just because we are going to be looking at some different tools that I like to use. And like I said, this is probably going to be short because talking to yourself into a microphone and having nobody to bounce ideas off of is kind of hard. So it's going to be probably short and sweet, and hopefully it is somewhat usable. All right, let's get started here. So what I have on the screen for you is some of the things that I usually look at when I'm trying to get ready for a fantasy draft. And to be honest, it looks a little prettier than usual, just so that I could try to make it displayed for this podcast. But these are usually elements that I try to look at in one form or another before I get ready for a draft. And I am getting ready for a draft tomorrow. We have some of our daily fantasy basketball podcast.com listener leagues that are going up tomorrow. I am playing in a few of those. So I wanted to make sure I was ready for the competition. So the first thing that I look at, and you can see up on the screen, is the rankings. And we preach here on our site the importance of having your very own rankings for your own league. And what do we mean by that is a lot of times the bigger sites will have simply just one ranking, one size fits all. It doesn't matter what categories your league uses. These are just generally our rankings. What we suggest is make sure that the categories that you're focusing on in your league, whether you have custom categories or whether you're punting certain categories, make sure that those categories that you're focusing on are what your rankings are based off of. Get very, specific rankings for your leagues. You can do that generally on our site. We have some different league variations that are posted for rankings. And if those don't cover your league, you can email us or tweet at us, Kyle or I, and we will get you custom rankings. So no excuse not to have some good rankings for your leagues. Our rankings are obviously based off our projections, but there's other places you can get rankings as well. Our friends over at Basketball Monster do a great job of that. So if you don't like how we do it, but you do want custom rankings, you can go to some different places. But anyway, it's just important to have your own rankings. Now, the league that I'm preparing for, that this data is shown for, is an 8-category ESPN league. So it's certainly not a custom league. But these rankings, so these are rankings that you could find just generally on our website. So the first thing I try to look at is where are players in our rankings compared to where they're going on ESPN. Now, the league that I'm playing in tomorrow is an ESPN league. So it is an ESPN auction league, excuse me. So I want to look at not necessarily just the rankings that where players are going on average, but how much on average people are spending on them. So I pulled that into this website or into this webpage. You can see at the top here is James Harden, and he is listed in our rankings for $71, and ESPN on average he goes for $68. So I would say there's a little bit of value to be had maybe with a James Harden pick. You can come down here and look a little bit lower at LeBron James, for example. We've got him valued as the 7th best player, worth $50. On average at ESPN, he's going for $63. So that's actually a negative $13 if he goes for his average price in his draft. So that might be a player that I want to avoid. And you can see his teammate just a little bit lower, Kyrie Irving. Probably people are being a little scared off by his injury. We're not as scared, I guess. So we're saying he's worth $35. ESPN, his average draft value is $18. So there's a $17 value. So that's probably a player I want to target. So, and you can see all my rankings are here. I'm comparing the auction values that I have to ESPN's average auction values and just trying to look for some value plays. And to make it nice and easy for you guys, I made a second extra column here that shows the best values, the best value players, and their dollar differentials. And maybe it'd be a good point in the podcast to just stop here and talk about some of those players. The number one guy on our list as far as best value compared to where we have him versus where he's going in ESPN drafts. And I guess I should mention this is for a roto league or a rotisserie league, or if you're not punting any categories. So I am preparing for a roto draft, but you would do the same thing if you decided not to punt. But again, if you wanted custom rate, if you wanted to punt some categories or do a head-to-head league rankings, you would get custom values under those circumstances. And then what you'll notice is in those type of situations, the value is can be really extreme, because you'll see players that you value very, very highly. Like if you're punting free throw percentage and assists, you might see DeAndre Jordan at the top of this list, where he's only going in ESPN leagues at, let's see, Andre Drummond, let's just go with him. He's going in ESPN leagues for $24. If you punt, excuse me, if you punt free throw percentage in blocks, or excuse me, free throw percentage in assists, he might be worth like $70, and he's only going for $25. So the value on that player might be like, $45, $50. But again, we're not punting here. So my rankings kind of line up with ESPN. So the biggest value player we see is Trevor Ariza. He's going for, I think only $3 or $4 on ESPN. We have him ranked as there he is, our 31st best player, worth $25. He's only going for $4 on ESPN. So we've got him as a $21 value. And I've talked about Trevor Ariza all season, or all preseason. He's so good at getting 3-pointers and getting steals. He's a very adequate rebounder. He gets you enough in points. He's a good free throw percentage shooter. So he really can contribute in a lot of different areas. And like I said, he's elite at 3-pointers and at steals, which I'll show you a little bit more on that later. But that's why I don't understand why he goes so low in drafts. I guess he's just not a sexy player. The whole thing we talk about sometimes, where you're not really going to get patted on the back by your league mates if you draft Trevor Ariza. There's no excitement there. And so he seems to be slipping in drafts. Some of the other players at the top of our list, Markieff Morris, probably somewhat due to his off the court issues in Phoenix and the worry that he might be traded. And if you're worried about that, you might want to steer clear of him, but we've got him as an excellent value, I think. I'm trying to scroll down and make sure I can show you where he's at. We've got Morris. Let's see. We've got Markieff Morris as the 48th best player in our rankings. He's only going for $3 in ESPN league. So he's somebody that I'm probably going to want to target. I mean, if I think he's a $20 player, even if I think he's a $10 player and he's going for $3, it's going to be tough for me not to draft him unless I'm just out of money by that point in the draft. A couple of the other players that we're high on, Kyrie Irving, as I mentioned, we've got him listed as our 15th best player, is worth $35. And ESPN leagues, he's only going in ESPN drafts, he's only going for $18. So we say that's a $17 value. Excuse me. And we've got some injury risk priced into his projection. We got him only projected for 66 games. That would mean he'd be able to miss, the first 10 games of the season and then miss 6 games throughout the season. That seems like a reasonable expectation of him. And we've still got him ranked as the 15th best player. So I think there's a lot of value to be had with Kyrie Irving. The last guy I'll mention that you can see on this list, number 4, is Nikola Mirotic. It seems more and more likely that he's going to be the starter in Chicago. So frankly, we might be too low on him. But he is going, let's see, we've got him ranked 46th as a $21 value. He's going for $4 on ESPN leagues. I don't understand necessarily why people are not higher on him. He does some excellent things when he's on the court, fantasy wise. He's a gunner, so he's going to get you points. He's going to get you 3-pointers. He does relatively well in the defensive categories. He played all 82 games last season. He shoots well from the line. So that's definitely going to help you in a roto league. He does have a poor field goal percentage, but considering everything else he gives you, I think he's worth taking a risk on. And definitely worth the $4 that he's going for in ESPN leagues, or even if you need to go up to 10. So those are kind of how I start looking for players to draft. I start to try to identify these high value players, the players that I think are ranked way too low or going way too low in auction leagues. The next thing I do is we talk a lot about team building in fantasy basketball. That's probably the most unique part of the game. You're not playing a points-based game where you're just trying to add up your yards and your touchdowns and make sure your team has 100 or 200 points or whatever, kind of a DraftKings style. In season-long leagues, what you're trying to do is balance your categories and make sure your team is built in a way that you can win multiple categories. And in a rotisserie league, you almost want to be good in every single type of category. So one thing I like to do is I like to look at my leagues, the history of some of my leagues, and look at what sort of benchmarks make me able to win a category. So you can see that down here. I want to make sure I'm still displaying this on the screen. Yeah. These are some benchmarks, I think. So this is like what it would take to be first in your league, second in your league, third in your league. And I'll just go over them really quickly, especially for the people listening. But, like on field goal percentage, I think you need to have a 48% field goal percentage or so to be able to win your field goal percentage in your rotisserie league, and probably an 80% free throw percentage. And if these, you can divide these out and they'll make a little bit more sense on a per player basis here. And then, for 3-pointers, I think if you're going to win that category, you probably need 1.2 3-pointers per player, and 6.5 rebounds and 4 assists and 1.2 steals and almost a block, and roughly 16 points per player if you're going to win points. And that's why you can see if our recommendation is always, if you're going to try to win points, which in a rotisserie league you need to do. In a head-to-head league, you can decide to punt that if you want, but in a rotisserie league, you need to win points. You've got to draft them, and you've got to draft so that your team averages roughly 16 points a game, at least in the league that I'm planning to play in. Obviously, in a deeper league, that points average would have to be lower, or could be lower, and in a more shallow league, it could be higher, even than the 16.5. So this, just for context, this is a 12-team league, so a pretty standard league. And I actually took these benchmarks from one of my 10-team leagues. I wanted to make sure I was putting a mark that that if I hit, I would win that category. So I'm using a 10-team league historical stats to try to tell me what I need to do for a 12-team league. And if I fall a little short of my benchmarks, there's a good chance I'll still win the category. Last thing I like to do, so I do use those benchmarks, and I try to put different players, try to have a plan of which players I want to draft. So what I'll do is I'll start with some of these high value players. Maybe I'll draft, I'll pick the top, 5 or 7 here, and I'll put them here onto my, this is just a fancy place in my spreadsheet. Oops. That tracks how many stats I'm getting from these players, and then tells me where I'm falling according to the benchmarks, my historical benchmarks, so that I can kind of decide, if I go for just these value players, you can see my free throw percentage looks pretty good. I'll finish, roughly with 9 points in that category, but my field goal percentage looks pretty bad. And that's because some of the high value guys are people like Trevor Ariza, who has a bad field goal percentage. Ricky Rubio has a bad field goal percentage. And Nikola Mirotic, who has a bad field goal percentage. So maybe, even though all three of those guys are good values, I don't need to target all three of those guys. And you can see I'm kind of adding up. This is how much they cost on ESPN. You can see I'm even with these 7 guys that I think are really excellent values, I'm only at $50. So I can start to add in higher price guys that I think maybe can help me out, that maybe aren't, great values. But I can look over at this list and say, hey, now I've got all these good values that I'm planning to pick. Maybe I can throw in James Harden, even though he's going to cost me $68, because I think that's going to help me, make sure I'm high enough in some of these other categories and I can spend my money appropriately. Or maybe I'll decide I want to grab Eric Bledsoe and Kyrie Irving, so I could put them in. And you can see what I'm basically, this is just a fancy way to add up which stats these guys are that I'm targeting are good at and not good at, and help me understand if I'm weak in a category or strong in a category. The last thing that I look at and that I try to use is I have a way, I like to rank each player by the value they provide in each category. So what I have over here is a top 25 ranking for each category for the value. So this first one you can see is just players that provide, if all we cared about was field goal percentage value, here are the top players. And you can see, start with DeAndre Jordan, Hassan Whiteside is second, Anthony Davis is third, Mason Plumlee is fourth. So that's kind of interesting, right? Like if I'm at the end of the draft and I know I need field goal percentage, maybe I know, I can get Mason Plumlee really cheap for $1 or something. And you can see he's going to probably hurt my free throw percentage. He's not going to help me out at threes at all. But if I'm just trying to get field goal percentage, you can see he bumped me up. I think, I was kind of this pretend team that I'm putting together of just kind of players I'm targeting would have finished dead last against my benchmarks in field goal percentage. Just adding Mason Plumlee, who is a player that probably most people don't think about, that bumps me up to 5 points in field goal percentage. Now it does bump me down in free throw percentage. And that's where this balancing act comes. And again, so here's a place. It looks like my team right now is kind of low on rebounds and blocks. So I can come over to this list and look at guys who are good at rebounds and blocks. And I'm kind of going to look through some of the guys that won't go earlier in drafts, but will be able to help me still. And honestly, for a rotisserie draft, I'm probably looking for guys who are not going to kill my free throw percentage even more than Mason Plumlee. So I see Marc Gasol over there. I know he's good at percentages. I know he's good at blocks. So I might try to put him in with my group. And again, his percentages are great. He's going to be strong in rebounds. He's going to be strong in blocks. So you can see my category rankings are starting to come along nicely. And I'm only at $120. Now, generally what I'll do is I'll try to target spending. If I'm looking at ESPN's average auction values, I'll usually try to spend between $170 and $180 of those on players that I'm targeting, because I know inevitably there will be just bidding wars that you won't win. So if you plan to spend $200 before the draft, then if one of those players goes above their average amount by $1, you can no longer make that team. So I want to give myself some wiggle room. I want to make sure that I have enough room to get the players that I'm targeting. With all of this said, this is just sort of a general guide. I might go into the draft having fine-tuned this and balanced this to the point where I feel pretty good that I'm going to be a top 3 or 4 team in every ranking. Maybe I realize I need to take Rubio off of here and add Reggie Jackson, or I play around with this enough that and again, this is a tool that I use, but you don't have to use a tool. You can add it up and make sure you're happy with where you're at. in each category, or you can just kind of even go more subjective than that and say, hey, if I get Nikola Mirotic and he's my forward and he's going to be bad at field goal percentage, I know I need to get somebody who's great at field goal percentage. So I'm going to draft Kevin Durant or Blake Griffin or whoever. And that's where I really find these top player at each category rankings very helpful when you're going into a draft, and just have it's nice to be able to look over here and say, hey, who's really good at free throw percentage that I can add? You can always see a couple of the top guys, and then there's inevitably somebody on the list like Isaiah Thomas is the fourth best player in fantasy at free throw percentage value. So he's a guy that if I'm going through the draft and I feel like, oh, I'm not doing so well at free throw percentage, I can maybe try to add him on the cheap. Or, look, Tyson Chandler is the seventh best guy at rebounds. He's somebody I can add late. So anyway, what I'll try to do is I'll try to identify a grouping of players that I think can help me hit the category. I kind of want to finish either first, second, third, or fourth in each category. I feel like that's a good way to try to win your rotisserie league. And so anyway, I'll kind of have a grouping of players that I think will get me there. But that's just, something I use as a general guide. Like when I actually get in the draft, you can't expect everybody to exactly spend the ESPN average amount on every player. So you need to be a little bit flexible. If all of a sudden Kevin Durant, ESPN's average value is that he's going for $67. If he's all of a sudden going in the mid 50s, because who knows why people are worried about drafting Kevin Durant, then you need to jump on that and sort of be able to adjust this either by using a spreadsheet or in your head to say, now I've got Kevin Durant. I probably had originally planned to use that money on, let's just say Marc Gasol and Eric Bledsoe. So now I need to adjust that. And, like I said, you can either do it with the draft tool and just delete them out of your spreadsheet, or you can do it in your head and say, hey, if I was planning to spend that money on Marc Gasol and I just spent it on Kevin Durant, I probably need more rebounds and blocks. So I need to target one more rebound and block guy than I originally had. But the point is that the two things you're really trying to do is you're trying to gain value by spending your money on players that you can buy for a lot lower than your auction value says they can go for. And the other thing you're trying to do is make sure you're balanced in categories, because even if you get a lot of fantasy value, but it's only concentrated in a few categories, especially in rotisserie leagues, you're not going to be able to win. You need to have a way somehow to balance that among all the categories that you're focusing on. And if you're a spreadsheet guy like I am, and it makes sense for you to have a spreadsheet, you do that. If you're not a spreadsheet guy and you can just kind of know in your head what's going on, and if you pick a point guard that you're good at assists and steals and 3-pointers, but that you're not good at rebounds and blocks, and you need to add a rebounds and blocks guy, that's a good way to do it too. But yeah, that's sort of how I, try to get ready for a draft. I'll try to, as best I can, identify where value is going to come from. But what I don't want to do is prohibit myself, get so locked into those few players that I prevent myself from finding value in the draft. And again, here you can see some of the players that I think are really going to have a lot of value in the draft. We talked about a few of them. Ricky Rubio is a guy that I didn't necessarily mention, but he's high on our list. The assists and steals are just so valuable. I think sometimes people overlook what he can give you. Tim Duncan is going low in drafts. I think that might be a Trevor Ariza thing, where people are just not excited to have him necessarily. And they're worried that he's going to sit out games. But historically, he doesn't play a lot fewer games than anybody else at his position. And so, Jordan Clarkson's another guy we like, Derek Favors, Thaddeus Young, they all can definitely help you right now in ESPN leagues. They're all going for roughly $15 or more lower than they should be. And along with getting that value, make sure you're balancing your categories appropriately. And like I said, I think the best way for me to be able to do it is just to know who's really, really good in each category. and this rankings list helps me out a lot. If for whatever reason you want to see this rankings list, I'd be happy to. If you want to tweet at me, I can send it to you, or maybe we can post it on the website if we get enough requests. All right, guys, that's about all I have for you. I think if I sit here and talk to myself any longer, I'll probably go crazy. So hopefully this was helpful. May have been more in depth than is useful, or maybe you're done with your fantasy draft and then that's not helpful either. But anyway, I wanted to have a chance to just share with you how I usually try to get ready for fantasy drafts when I have the time to do it. And these are the type of things I look at. So thanks a lot for listening. I think our next podcast, Kyle and I will be back together. And if you haven't had a chance, please go rate and review the podcast. Say nice things about Kyle. Say nice things about our podcast. That would be excellent. And we'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks a lot for listening. Bye.